The story of soul food, a taste of history and survival. Before soul food ever had a name, it was simply the food of survival, meals born from struggle, ingenuity, and love. These weren't recipes written in books or measured with spoons. They were learned by heart, passed from one generation to the next, stirred into memory as much as into pots. The story of soul food is the story of America itself, told through hands that worked the fields, kitchens that doubled as classrooms, and communities that turned scarcity into culture. When enslaved Africans were brought to the New World, they carried more than chains. They carried knowledge of farming, flavor, and food that nourished both body and spirit. Out of what they were given, cornmeal, greens, pork scraps, beans, and rice, they built a cuisine rooted in resilience. Every dish had meaning. Hoecakes cooked on iron blades became a symbol of resourcefulness. Chitlins, collard greens, and ham hocks turned scraps into celebration. Okra gumbo carried the taste of Africa across an ocean, while red drinks honored memory and life itself. In every kitchen, these meals spoke the same message. You cannot take away our flavor, our strength, or our joy. As time passed, soul food evolved. Through emancipation, Jim Crow, and the Great Migration, recipes followed families from the South to the North, from the country to the city. They changed with each new setting, refined in Harlem kitchens, reinvented in Chicago diners, reimagined in Los Angeles backyard cookouts. But the essence stayed the same. These were dishes made with care, designed to stretch, to heal, to bring people together. Soul food became the cuisine of community. It was what you brought to the church potluck, what you served after a funeral, what you cooked on Sundays when everyone gathered under one roof. Even in the hardest times, these meals brought comfort. They turned hunger into hope and ingredients into identity. But with progress came distance. As fast food and convenience took over, some of these traditional dishes faded from view, replaced by quicker, easier meals that left little room for ritual. Yet the memory remains. Each forgotten dish holds a story worth retelling. Stories of how a people turned survival into soul and hardship into heritage. This is the legacy of 15 forgotten soul food classics that shaped American culture. Dishes that don't just fill a plate, but speak of endurance, creativity, and pride. Charwan, hoecakes, the pancake, born on the fields. You can almost hear the crackle of firewood and smell the faint scent of cornmeal browning in the air. Somewhere in the deep South, long before electric stoves or shiny kitchen pans, a laborer bends down after a day's work, spreading a bit of batter on the flat blade of a hoe. That's how the hoecake was born, not in a kitchen, but on the fields. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, cornmeal was a lifeline. Enslaved Africans had little to cook with, but they knew how to make something from almost nothing. Mixing cornmeal with water, a pinch of salt, and maybe a drop of lard if they were lucky, they created a kind of pancake that could be cooked over an open flame. The flat, wide metal surface of a hoe, the same tool used for endless hours of labor, became the perfect makeshift griddle. It was simple food, but it carried deep meaning. Hoecakes filled stomachs when the cupboards were bare. They were portable, hearty, and easy to make, a survival food that required no luxury, only resourcefulness. When George Washington wrote in his diaries that he had breakfasted on hoecakes, it showed how this humble food moved beyond the fields, slowly finding its way to the tables of rich and poor alike. But for the Black families who continued making them through Reconstruction and well into the 20th century, hoecakes weren't just about sustenance. They were a memory. They connected generations through the act of cooking, a reminder that even in hardship, there was creativity, dignity, and flavor. As African Americans migrated north during the Great Migration, they carried hoecakes with them. The recipe adapted. Some fried them in skillets, others made them fluffier with milk and eggs, but the soul stayed the same. In the hum of city kitchens from Chicago to New York, the sizzle of hoecakes was a whisper of the South, a taste of home. Today, few people realize how much history sits in that golden, crisp edge. Hoecakes represent survival, ingenuity, and a quiet defiance, the refusal to let circumstance erase culture. They remind us that American cooking wasn't built in fine dining rooms, but in fields, cabins, and small kitchens where people made do and made magic. So, the next time you see a stack of cornbread cakes or pancakes on a plate, think of the hands that first mixed cornmeal and water under the sun. That humble creation became a foundation of Southern cuisine, one that still carries the spirit of those who first made it. And from those same fields where hoe cakes sizzled, another dish was born, one that turned the cast off parts of the animal into a symbol of celebration and survival. How's your two? Chitlins, chitterlings, poverty's feast turned tradition. The smell is unmistakable, sharp, earthy, and for some, overwhelming. But for others, that scent means family, holidays, and home. Chitlins, or chitterlings, are one of those dishes that divide opinions but unite history. They tell a story not of luxury, but of survival, and how the poorest cuts of meat became symbols of strength and celebration. The dish began during slavery, when enslaved Africans were given what plantation owners didn't want: pig intestines, feet, tails, and ears. They had to make something edible out of what others threw away. Cleaning and boiling chitlins was grueling work. It could take hours, sometimes days, to scrub and simmer them into tenderness. But with time, seasoning, and skill, those humble scraps transformed into a dish rich with flavor and heritage. During the winter hog killings in the rural South, every part of the pig was used, nothing wasted. The intestines became chitlins, seasoned with vinegar, onion, and hot pepper. Families would gather around large pots, swapping stories while the aroma filled the air. In those moments, chitlins weren't just food, they were an act of defiance, a declaration that even in the harshest conditions, joy and community could still exist. When the Civil War ended and freedom came, chitlins didn't disappear. Instead, they evolved. Through the Great Migration, African American families carried the tradition north, cooking chitlins in small apartments and row houses during holidays. The dish became a centerpiece of Christmas and New Year's tables, paired with collard greens and cornbread, each food symbolizing hope, prosperity, and remembrance. By the mid-20th century, chitlins had become part of a broader cultural identity. You could hear them mentioned in blues songs and gospel lyrics, served in Southern diners and celebrated in chitlin circuit music halls where Black performers built a legacy outside mainstream venues. What once represented poverty became a shared cultural touchstone, proof that history can turn struggle into pride. Still, chitlins carry emotional weight. For some, they recall hardship and the memory of what ancestors endured. For others, they're a taste of home and continuity, a reminder that nothing was wasted, not food, not time, not spirit. Even today, during family gatherings in the South, you might find a pot of chitlins simmering slowly on the stove. Elders might tell you it's not just about the taste, it's about remembering where you came from, about turning scraps into soul. And as the pot of chitlins cools and the laughter fades, another pot begins to simmer, one filled with collard greens and ham hocks, a dish that turned a handful of leaves into a symbol of hope. On our 3, collard greens with ham hocks, a pot of hope. If you've ever lifted the lid on a simmering pot of collard greens, you know the moment. The cloud of steam rising, rich with the scent of smoked meat and slow-cooked leaves. It's more than a smell, it's a memory that runs deep through generations, linking Sunday dinners, family stories, and the will to survive with dignity. Collard greens go back long before the American South. Their roots trace to Africa, where dark leafy greens were a staple. When enslaved Africans were brought to America, they found collards, a relative of what they knew, growing in southern soil. They made do with what they could grow and what they were given, and soon collards became a cornerstone of soul food. The tradition of cooking greens low and slow with smoked meat came out of necessity. Families couldn't afford prime cuts, so they used what they had: ham hocks, pigtails, or even turkey necks to flavor the greens. Hours of simmering turned the tough leaves tender, and the result was hearty, comforting, and deeply nourishing. The broth that formed at the bottom of the pot was called pot liquor or pot liquor, and it wasn't wasted either. It was rich in nutrients and often sopped up with cornbread. For many, that liquid gold was as valuable as the greens themselves. During slavery and Reconstruction, collard greens symbolized resourcefulness and resilience. They were cheap, filling, and could feed a large family. Over time, they became centerpiece at Sunday dinners and holiday feasts, representing togetherness and faith. Even when times were hard, a pot of greens on the stove meant there was still something to share. By the 20th century, collards had become more than food. They were a cultural emblem. During the civil rights movement, activists gathered over meals of fried chicken, black-eyed peas, and collard greens, fueling bodies and spirits before marches. The greens became a quiet symbol of endurance, a reminder that strength often grows in humble places. Today, collard greens are still served across America, sometimes spiced with vinegar and red pepper flakes, sometimes cooked vegetarian style, but always with a story behind them. They represent transformation: how a handful of leaves could become a feast, how scraps could become sustenance, and how community could thrive even in scarcity. And when that pot of greens was shared, it was more than nourishment. It was hope, simmered and seasoned through history. And with New Year's Day around the corner, hope took another form, in a dish of black-eyed peas and rice that promised good fortune to anyone who believed. Hush for. 4. Hoppin' John, the New Year's promise. Every New Year's Day across the South, a familiar aroma fills kitchens: smoky bacon, soft rice, and earthy black-eyed peas bubbling together in one pot. That dish is Hoppin' John, a recipe older than the nation itself. For many African American families, it's more than a meal. It's a ritual, a promise of good luck, prosperity, and better days ahead. Hoppin' John's roots trace back to the early 1700s, when enslaved West Africans brought with them their knowledge of rice cultivation and their traditions of one-pot meals. Dishes like tibu dien in Senegal, rice, fish, and vegetables cooked together, share the same spirit as Hoppin' John. On southern plantations, those same techniques met local ingredients: black-eyed peas, salt pork, and Carolina gold rice. Out of that blend of necessity and memory, Hoppin' John was born. The name itself has been debated for centuries. Some say it came from the way people hopped with joy when the dish was ready. Others believe it came from a local street vendor nicknamed Hoppin' John, who sold rice and peas in Charleston. However it began, by the 19th century, the dish had already become a New Year's tradition in the South. Each ingredient carried meaning. The peas symbolized coins and wealth. The rice stood for abundance and the ability to make something stretch. The pork, often a ham hock or fatback, represented humility and hard work. Together they formed a kind of edible prayer that the coming year would bring security, health, and peace. And as the saying went, eat your Hoppin' John on New Year's Day and you'll eat well all year. During Reconstruction and beyond, this tradition became deeply rooted in Black communities. Even families who had moved north during the Great Migration still made sure to put a pot of Hoppin' John on the stove every January 1st. It was a way to stay connected, to home, to ancestors, to faith that the next year might be kinder than the last. Over time, the recipe evolved. Some added tomatoes for color, others swapped pork for turkey or sausage, but the meaning never changed. It remained a simple, hearty dish with a message that transcended hardship. Keep going, keep believing, keep cooking. Even today, you can find it in kitchens across America. A quiet reminder that the soul of a people can live inside a single bowl. Hoppin' John isn't fancy, but it's powerful. It's what happens when history, hope, and hunger meet in one pot. And when that pot was empty, many families turned to another, filled with tender neck bones and rice, a meal that stretched the weak and fed the spirit just the same. Hash 5, neck bones and rice, the meal that stretched time. There's a certain rhythm to a kitchen when neck bones are cooking. The slow bubble of broth, the gentle scrape of a spoon along the pot, and the rich aroma that tells you something good is happening. For generations of African American families, neck bones and rice weren't just dinner. They were endurance, comfort, and proof that a little could go a long way. Neck bones came from the parts of the hog that nobody else wanted. They were bony, full of connective tissue, and short on meat. But for those who had been given the least, they were a gift. With time, patience, and skill, these bones could be transformed into a dish rich in flavor and soul. Families would boil them for hours, coaxing every bit of meat and marrow into a tender stew that could stretch to feed many. The recipe was simple: neck bones, water, salt, pepper, and whatever seasoning could be spared, often garlic, onion, and a splash of vinegar or hot sauce. Poured over a mound of rice, it became hearty enough to fill stomachs and warm spirits after long days in the fields or factories. The dish wasn't about luxury, it was about survival with grace. For families across the South, neck bones and rice were a midweek staple, especially when money was tight. Children would come running when the smell hit the air. Grandmothers would stand over the pot, stirring slowly, teaching that good food doesn't require abundance, just care. It was the art of making do, something that defined soul food itself. As African Americans moved north and west during the Great Migration, neck bones traveled with them. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis, they became a link to home. But they also became a quiet statement, a reminder that resilience was as much a part of the meal as the rice beneath it. What made neck bones special wasn't just the flavor. It was what they represented: patience, thrift, and gratitude. Even when times improved and people could afford better cuts of meat, many still cooked neck bones on purpose, not because they had to, but because they wanted to remember. Every family had its own variation. Some made them in brown gravy. Others stewed them with beans or vegetables. No matter the version, the heart of the dish was always the same: turning scarcity into satisfaction. Neck bones and rice remind us that food isn't only about what's on the plate, it's about what it took to get there. The waiting, the work, the wisdom passed from hand to hand. And from that same pot of simmering patience came another dish, one with roots reaching across the ocean, where a small green seed called okra found new life in the American South. 6. Okra gumbo, the African seed that rooted in America. Long before gumbo became Louisiana's signature dish, before restaurants served it in steaming bowls with rice on the side, okra was already telling its own story, one that began across the Atlantic. This small green seed pod made its way to America through the transatlantic slave trade, carried in the memory, pockets, and hearts of Africans who refused to let their culture be erased. Okra was more than food. It was a piece of home. In West Africa, it thickened soups and stews, its texture transforming humble ingredients into something rich and comforting. When enslaved Africans arrived in the American South, they found familiar soil and began to grow it again. That act alone, planting a familiar seed in foreign ground, was a quiet form of resistance, a way of saying, "We are still here." From that resilience, gumbo was born. The earliest versions were not the seafood or sausage-filled versions we know today. They were simple: okra, vegetables, sometimes bits of meat or fish, whatever could be found. The word gumbo itself likely came from the Bantu word kingumbo, meaning okra. Over time, the dish became a reflection of America itself, a blend of African, indigenous, and European influences simmering together in one pot. Okra gumbo was a celebration of adaptation. Creole cooks added tomatoes and spices. Cajun families stirred in smoked sausage and chicken. In rural Black communities, it might have been nothing more than okra, onion, and a few bones for flavor, but it was filling, warm, and nourishing in every sense. Through the centuries, gumbo became a unifying dish. It was served at church gatherings, family reunions, and neighborhood block parties. Everyone had a recipe, and every version carried a story. For African Americans, it symbolized something deeper, the idea that when different elements come together with care and patience, something beautiful can emerge. Even today, okra remains one of those foods that sparks debate. Some love its silky texture, others avoid it entirely. But in its essence, okra gumbo is about transformation, taking what was brought in bondage and turning it into something that nourishes freedom. When you lift a spoonful of gumbo today, you're tasting centuries of history, a dish that crossed oceans, survived oppression, and still brings people to the table. It's proof that food can carry memory, migration, and meaning all at once. And from the same kitchens that perfected gumbo, another dish would soon fill the pot, one that took the humblest part of the hog and turned it into a meal that walked straight through history. Number 7, pig's feet, a dish that walked through history. The sound of bubbling broth and the slow, sticky rhythm of a simmering pot, that's how you know pig's feet are on the stove. To some, it's just another dish from the old days, but to others, it's a memory of family gatherings, survival, and a time when no part of the animal went to waste. Pig's feet aren't just about food, they're about endurance, the story of a people who made the unwanted unforgettable. In the time of slavery, the best cuts of meat went to the plantation owners, while enslaved Africans were left with the scraps, organs, tails, ears, and feet. What others discarded, they transformed. With salt, vinegar, and slow cooking, even the toughest, most overlooked pieces became tender and flavorful. Pig's feet, with their gelatin-rich skin and bone, were turned into something comforting and sustaining. Cooking them took patience. They had to be cleaned, boiled, and seasoned for hours until the meat nearly melted off the bone. A bit of hot sauce or mustard was often added for flavor. In some homes, they were pickled and stored in jars, a way to preserve food for weeks when refrigeration wasn't possible. Through the Reconstruction era and well into the 20th century, pig's feet stayed on the table. They were cheap, filling, and familiar. But they were more than that. They were a connection to the past, to the ancestors who had refused to give up their culinary ingenuity. In communities that faced constant hardship, this dish stood as a quiet triumph. You can't waste what we can turn into a meal. By the time the Great Migration began, pig's feet had made their way from southern farms to northern cities. You could find them in corner stores, diners, and barber shops, often sold from large glass jars near the counter. They became a taste of home for those who had left the South behind, a reminder that comfort could still be found in the familiar. Even as times changed and other dishes rose to fame, pig's feet never disappeared completely. They became a kind of cultural landmark, a food that marked where you came from and what your people had survived. For some, eating them was an act of remembrance. For others, it was simply tradition, passed down from a mother's hands to her children's plates. Pig's feet tell the story of turning hardship into heritage. They remind us that the line between survival food and soul food is thin and often defined by love, patience, and pride. And while pig's feet were often the meal, there was another dish that always stood beside them, bright red, sweet, and full of meaning. It wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of life and celebration. 8. Red drink, the taste of celebration and survival. Every culture has a color that carries meaning. For African Americans, that color has long been red, bright, bold, and full of life. From church picnics to Juneteenth celebrations, you'll almost always find something red on the table: strawberry soda, red Kool-Aid, or hibiscus tea. It's more than just a drink. It's a symbol that stretches from the heart of West Africa to the modern soul food table. A drink that tells a story of resilience, remembrance, and joy. The roots of red drink go back centuries. In West Africa, people brewed vibrant teas from hibiscus flowers, kola nuts, and sorrel. The drink wasn't just refreshing, it carried meaning. Red represented the life force, blood, strength, and vitality. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, they couldn't bring much with them, but they carried this tradition in memory. Over time, it blended with local ingredients and new influences, creating the red drinks we know today. In the early days of slavery, special occasions were rare, but when they came, harvests, holidays, or moments of rest, sweetened drinks made with berries or molasses offered comfort and celebration. After emancipation, those drinks became part of community gatherings, particularly Juneteenth, the day marking the end of slavery in Texas in 1865. Red drinks became part of the ritual, a toast to freedom, a nod to ancestors, a taste of survival. By the early 20th century, red drinks had evolved. Hibiscus tea was replaced in some homes with red sodas or powdered Kool-Aid mixes. They were cheap, accessible, and easy to make for large gatherings. Kids loved them, elders remembered the meaning behind them, and the color stayed the same, vibrant, alive, and unmissable. Even now, red drink isn't tied to one recipe. In some households, it's sweet tea with strawberries. In others, it's a rich hibiscus brew known as zobo or sorrel. What matters isn't the flavor, it's the connection. It's the way a single color can carry centuries of memory, from African soil to southern kitchens. To pour a glass of red drink is to honor both struggle and joy. It's a reminder that celebration can rise even from sorrow, that culture can survive across oceans, and that something as simple as a drink can hold a people's story. And after that glass is empty, the meal isn't over. Down by the riverbanks and catfish ponds of the South, another dish was waiting, crisp, golden, and caught by hand. And 9. Fried catfish, the river's gift to the table. There's something timeless about the sound of catfish sizzling in a cast iron skillet, that steady crackle of hot oil, the golden cornmeal crust forming, and the smell drifting across a backyard or riverside. For many African American families, fried catfish wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual that marked the end of a long week, a Saturday night treat, or a Sunday reward for hard work done. Catfish was the people's fish. It lived in muddy southern rivers and could be caught with little more than a hook, a line, and patience. For those who didn't have money to spend at the butcher or market, the river offered abundance. Fishing became both survival and pastime, a quiet moment of peace in a world that rarely allowed it. Men and boys would line the riverbanks at dawn, poles in hand, waiting for a tug beneath the water's surface. Whatever was caught became dinner, shared and celebrated. Once home, the cleaning and cooking began. The fish were dredged in seasoned cornmeal, sometimes with salt, pepper, and a little cayenne, then fried in hot oil until crispy on the outside and flaky inside. The result was simple but perfect. Fried catfish was often served with hush puppies, coleslaw, and slices of white bread, the kind of plate that could feed a crowd and stretch $1. During segregation, catfish fries became a community tradition. Church groups, clubs, and families gathered around large outdoor fryers, telling stories and sharing laughter as the sun went down. It wasn't just about the food, it was about togetherness, about creating joy and belonging even when the world outside offered little of either. By the mid-20th century, fried catfish had earned a special place in soul food culture. It was both rustic and celebratory, found in home kitchens, roadside diners, and later in restaurants that carried Southern cooking to city neighborhoods. Each bite carried history, the river, the labor, and the satisfaction of turning nature's gift into comfort. Even today, catfish fries bring people together. It's not fancy cuisine, and that's exactly the point. It's about simplicity done right. It's about catching your meal with your own hands, cooking it with love, and sharing it with others. Fried catfish reminds us that some of the richest flavors in American history didn't come from wealth, but from water, patience, and pride. It's the taste of summer evenings, the hum of conversation, and the deep roots of Southern life. And while catfish filled the table on weekends, another dish sustained families day after day, rich in nutrients, humble in cost, and strong enough to keep generations going. Number 10, liver and onions, the forgotten superfood of the South. The scent of liver frying in a skillet is one you never forget, sharp, rich, and savory, mingling with the sweetness of caramelized onions. For many who grew up in the South, that smell meant dinner was almost ready. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good food. And more importantly, it was smart food, the kind that kept families nourished when money was scarce. Liver has always been a practical choice. During slavery and well into the early 20th century, the prime cuts of meat went elsewhere, leaving organ meats for those at the bottom of the social ladder. But what others saw as scraps, black cooks turned into something sustaining. Liver, packed with iron and vitamins, became a powerful meal that could feed and strengthen a household on a small budget. The preparation was simple but deliberate. Sliced liver, usually from beef or pork, was dredged lightly in flour, then pan-fried in bacon grease or lard. Onions were added, cooked slowly until they turned golden and sweet, cutting through the bitterness of the liver. Served with rice, mashed potatoes, or cornbread, it was a complete meal, dense, flavorful, and hearty enough to fill everyone at the table. For many African American families, liver and onions became a midweek staple. It was affordable, quick, and nutritious, the kind of dish that mothers and grandmothers made to keep children healthy when resources were thin. In those kitchens, food wasn't about indulgence, it was about care. Every meal was an act of love disguised as thrift. By the 1940s and 50s, liver had even found its way into school lunches and military rations. Doctors praised it as the working man's health food. But over time, as convenience foods took over and tastes changed, liver faded from dinner tables. What was once seen as practical and good for you became old-fashioned, a relic of leaner years. Still, for those who remember, liver and onions isn't just a dish, it's a memory. It reminds people of parents and grandparents who made the most of what they had, who cooked from instinct and necessity, not recipes. The sizzle of liver in a pan brings back the sound of those evenings, the clatter of forks, the hum of conversation, the quiet satisfaction of having a meal worth working for. Liver and onions represents a kind of wisdom that's easy to forget in modern kitchens. That nourishment doesn't come from extravagance, but from intention. It's the story of how health, resourcefulness, and soul once shared the same plate. And when dinner was done and something sweet was needed to balance the day, another dish would always appear on Southern tables. What the soul remembers. When you look back at these 15 forgotten dishes, you realize they're more than recipes. They're living history. Each one holds a fragment of the past, a reminder of where we came from and what it took to get here. In every pot of greens, every pan of fried catfish, every slice of sweet potato pie, there's a story of survival and spirit. Soul food began as the food of necessity, but it became the food of identity. It took what was limited and made it abundant, what was unwanted and made it sacred. The same creativity that turned cornmeal into hoecakes and scraps into stews also turned struggle into pride. These dishes carried a people through centuries of hardship and change, preserving not just flavor, but history itself. Today, when younger generations rediscover these meals, when they ask their elders for recipes, or when they gather around the stove to cook them again, they're doing more than reviving old flavors. They're continuing a story that says, we endured, we created, and we still remember. To eat these foods is to honor those who came before, the hands that stirred the pots, the voices that sang over them, the families who gathered no matter what the world outside looked like. In every bite is a legacy, one built not from luxury, but from love. Soul food is and always has been more than food. It's a language, one that speaks of freedom, community, and faith. And though some of its classics may have been forgotten by time, their spirit remains, waiting to be cooked again, remembered again, and passed on, the way all true soul food should be. Would you like me to adjust the introduction and conclusion to include a brief modern reflection, like how some of these dishes are being rediscovered today in restaurants or by younger chefs? It would add a nice full circle moment.